safe. When they finally spoke hours later, Colette was furious, screaming that their children genuinely believed they had watched their father die on television. The trust she had that he would not jeopardize their family was deeply fractured. When Foley finally returned home, he was so physically shattered that he required assistance just to undress and get into bed. He was diagnosed with a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, missing teeth, requiring 15 facial stitches, and an undocumented but severe concussion. Yet, professionally, the match accomplished exactly what Foley had gambled his life for. It completely transformed how the audience and the corporate office viewed him. He went from being a performer Vince McMahon didn't even want on the roster, to capturing the world championship just 6 months later. The fans respected his unbelievable sacrifice. He had cemented his legacy. But success breeds a dangerous addiction. The bar for violence had been raised to an impossible height, and Foley felt a deep-seated pressure to continually live up to his moniker as the hardcore legend. Executive Jim Ross sat Foley down and issued a stern warning, advising him that if he continued to push the limits of human physical endurance, the damage would eventually catch up with him. Foley understood the warning, but fundamentally disagreed with the premise. He was riding a tidal wave of momentum and refused to step off the board. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed the boundaries of safety once again in an infamous "I Quit" match against emerging superstar The Rock. Against the desperate advice of his peers, Foley constructed a match designed around excessive, unprotected blows to the head. The storyline dictated that the match could not be stopped for blood loss or injury. During the climax of the bout, Foley was handcuffed, rendering him unable to block incoming strikes. The original plan called for him to take 5 unprotected hits to the head with a steel chair. But in the heat of the moment, the adrenaline took over. Foley instructed The Rock to hit him as hard as possible. He ended up absorbing an agonizing 11 unprotected chair shots to the skull. The footage of the "I Quit" match remains sickening to watch. Foley's family was sitting in the front row of the arena. His young children sobbed hysterically as they watched their father being bludgeoned into unconsciousness. The psychological trauma inflicted on his family was profound. His daughter Noelle later revealed that she blocked out the memory entirely, possessing no singular memory of her father ever wrestling because her subconscious could not process the horrific violence she witnessed that night. By absorbing 11 direct blows to the head for the sake of a television angle, Foley willingly subjected himself to severe brain trauma. Where does it end? What does it take to put a man down when he refuses to surrender? Foley has openly admitted that he understood his chosen style would result in great discomfort. He confessed that there were countless times he could have executed a maneuver safely, but actively chose the more painful route simply because he believed it looked better for the audience. Eventually, the medical reality could no longer be ignored. Multiple doctors advised Foley that he needed to stop immediately, warning him that continuing his career would result in him being permanently crippled. Yet, driven by the belief that he always had one more great match left in him, he tried to delay the inevitable. He wrestled through severe physical deterioration. There were times when he would drive his car and suddenly realize he could not remember where he lived. A terrifying consequence of suffering concussion upon concussion. A pivotal moment occurred during a consultation with an independent neurologist. After reviewing Foley's extensive history of head trauma, the doctor looked him in the eye and delivered a chilling verdict. He told Foley that while he could always shop around to find a doctor willing to clear him, the medical truth was that he should never step foot inside a wrestling ring again. Today, the wrestling industry has a much deeper understanding of the long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries and concussions. Taking a physical bump in a wrestling ring is akin to experiencing a 25-mile-per-hour car accident. The repetitive trauma Foley subjected his brain to carries the severe risk of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a devastating degenerative brain disease. Foley lives with the heavy consequences of his fame. He endures chronic physical pain and harbors deep anxieties about his cognitive future. His daughter worries every single day about what his mental state will look like in 10 or 20 years. Foley himself admits that when he evaluates the fallout from the extreme risks he took, he struggles to see a clear way out of the neurological damage he has incurred. Yet, he refuses to succumb to despair. Instead of living in constant fear of the unknown, he actively fights cognitive decline. He performs spoken word tours across the globe, utilizing the storytelling as mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp. The stimulation of a live audience, the roar of the crowd chanting his name, remains a vital part of his lifeblood. His family encourages him to pursue these passions, while gently reminding him not to push his luck any further. Mick Foley is a complex figure. He is a multiple-time world champion, a dedicated philanthropist, and a beloved icon. But his identity is inextricably tied to those 17 minutes inside hell in a cell. For years, he harbored a deep resentment toward that match, plunging into a dark depression because he felt that despite all his diverse accomplishments in the industry, he was solely remembered for acting as a human crash test dummy. He felt as though he had achieved everything, yet paradoxically, nothing at all. Acceptance came slowly. During a reflective conversation with The Undertaker years later, the legendary Phenom offered a profound perspective. He looked at Foley and simply stated that what they accomplished that night would outlive them both. That realization allowed Foley to finally embrace the legacy of Hell in a Cell. He recognized that the ultimate goal of his career was to create unforgettable moments, to command the awe of total strangers. And on that night in 1998, he delivered a spectacle that defied logic, reason, and mortality. The emotional weight of that night remains staggering. Years after his retirement, Foley and his daughter visited a corporate warehouse where historic props were stored. Tucked away in the massive facility, they stumbled upon the original steel panels of the Hell in a Cell structure. Foley walked up to the rusted metal, placed his hand on the cage, and began to weep. His daughter noted that she had never seen her father cry before. The tears were a profound acknowledgement of the trauma, the fear, and the miraculous reality that he had survived an event that could have so easily ended his life. Looking back, Foley acknowledges the terrible risks. He recognizes that no monetary reward or fleeting moment of fame is truly worth the potential loss of a father, a husband, or a life. While he admits that modern knowledge of head injuries might have changed his approach, he does not live in regret. He viewed the wrestling ring as a canvas, and he used his own body to paint a surreal, sublime, and violent form of performance art. It was a perilous journey, filled with terrible bumps in the road, but for Mick Foley, the roar of the crowd made it a deeply magical way to make a living. On the nights when the connection with the audience was pure, it provided one of the most powerful feelings in the human experience. The story of Hell in a Cell is not just a story about a wrestling match. It is a psychological study of a man seeking love through sacrifice. It is an exploration of the dangerous lengths performers will go to secure their legacy. It stands as a monolithic testament to human endurance, a terrifying moment frozen in time that changed an industry, shattered a man's body, and forever etched the name Mankind into the annals of sporting immortality. Was it worth it? That is a question only Mick Foley can truly answer, as he carries the physical and mental scars of that night for the rest of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, I have sat at ringside for decades, watching the landscape of professional wrestling evolve from dimly lit armories to colossal stadiums. I have seen the greatest triumphs and the most agonizing tragedies this industry has to offer. But there is one night, one specific match, that remains permanently burned into the collective consciousness of anyone who witnessed it. It is a night that forces us to ask terrifying questions about the limits of human endurance, the psychological hunger for applause, and the incredibly fine line between sports entertainment and genuine catastrophe. The date was June 28, 1998. The venue was the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. A packed house of 16,000 people eagerly awaited the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view event. The marquee promised a spectacle, The Undertaker versus Mankind in a Hell in a Cell match. But what the world got was not just a wrestling match. It was a descent into absolute madness, a dangerously crazy masterpiece that stands as both an epic success and a grim cautionary tale. According to the accounts of those involved, the industry dodged multiple fatal bullets that evening. And when the dust settled, the lingering question echoed through the locker room and the arena. When is it enough? This is the story of that night, the psychology that built it, and the collateral damage that followed. The architecture of a madman. To understand why a human being would willingly hurl his body into the abyss, you have to understand the mind of Mick Foley. According to his own admissions, everyone who steps inside a wrestling ring is looking for something missing in their own lives. For Foley, it was an overwhelming need to be liked. He was a kid who endured teasing, a young man desperately searching for validation. Foley recounts a defining moment during his sophomore year of college. Seeking a reaction from his peers, he filled his mouth with red food coloring, climbed atop a bed, and launched himself onto a stuffed animal resting on a solid concrete floor. Upon impact, he spat the fake blood across the room. One of the female students yelled out in pure horror, calling it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that moment of revulsion, Foley found his power. He realized a fundamental, twisted truth about his own psyche. If he could not force people to love him, he could certainly force them to be disgusted, shocked, and awed. He needed to get a reaction. This craving birthed a career built on unimaginable punishment. As his daughter, Noelle Foley, recounts, a normal Mick Foley match was never just a wrestling exhibition. It was a showcase of brutality, blood, thumbtacks, fire, barbed wire, explosive charges in Japan, and horrific falls onto bare concrete. He did not simply tolerate pain, he harnessed it. He sold it in a way that captivated audiences. But as those closest to him note, the realism was his ultimate tool. Foley himself admitted that he did not think he had delivered a good performance unless he struggled to walk back to his hotel room. His wife, Colette, who has known him for over 35 years, paints a different picture of the man behind the madness. Behind the scars and the missing teeth was a gentle soul, a man whose corny jokes and terrible humor won her heart. They walked down the aisle to the theme song from Beauty and the Beast. Yet, she understood his terrifying commitment to his craft. When the adrenaline pumped through his veins, his only drive was to ensure the fans left the arena talking about his performance, completely at his own risk. From the Japanese death match to the World Wrestling Federation, before he was Mankind, Foley developed the unhinged persona of Cactus Jack. Jim Cornette, an agent and producer for the World Wrestling Federation at the time, observed that Foley possessed a unique charisma. You simply could not take your eyes off him. He was a master of ring psychology, understanding perfectly that fans were mesmerized by someone who appeared completely out of control, someone who seemed to be going entirely off the script. His journey took him far from American television. In the early days of their marriage, Colette remembers their bedroom furniture consisting of a mattress on the floor and a tiny black and white television with a video cassette player that barely functioned. On that screen, Foley would study Japanese wrestling tapes for up to 12 hours a day. He was drawn to the storytelling and the intense realism where a wrestler did not just fight an opponent. They had to survive their environment. Japan was where Foley thought he would spend his career, making a name for himself in explosive, fiery deathmatch alongside his mentor, the legendary Terry Funk. Funk was a master at making audiences suspend their disbelief, and Foley learned to literally crawl on his hands and knees through broken glass and wire just to prove he had done something special. But destiny had a larger stage waiting, even if the executives did not see it at first. The World Wrestling Federation during that era was primarily a general audience product, heavily reliant on larger-than-life superheroes. Vince McMahon, the head of the company, initially had zero interest in hiring Mick Foley. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, McMahon did not think Foley was marketable or aesthetically appealing. It took the relentless advocacy of Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations, to convince McMahon to take a chance. Ross needed a believable, chaotic dance partner for their cornerstone attraction, The Undertaker. McMahon eventually relented, slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to hire Foley. But under one strict condition, they would cover his face. McMahon wanted to obscure his identity entirely, viewing him as a nobody. From that harsh directive, the character of Mankind was born. As Hall of Famer Jerry Briscoe recalls, they were tasked with building a character out of nothing. But the genius of the Mankind character was that it would not have worked with any other human being on the planet. Foley threw his entire soul into the demented, hair-pulling, shrieking persona. He proved that without a genuine connection to the audience, all the elaborate costuming in the world is meaningless. Fans sense commitment, and Foley was willing to try absolutely anything. The inception of Hell in a Cell. By the summer of 1998, Foley and The Undertaker had built a legendary rivalry spanning 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches across the globe. But Foley felt his character had plateaued. He needed to do something monumental to elevate their legacy. Producers decided to reignite their feud using a newly developed match concept: Hell in a Cell. The traditional steel cage had been revolutionized. Instead of escaping over the top or through a door, the combatants were locked inside a massive, roofed structure. Only one man would walk out. The first iteration of this match had occurred 9 months prior between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, setting an unbelievably high standard. Foley knew he could not athletically match what Michaels had done. Desperate for inspiration, he asked his mentor, Terry Funk, for ideas. According to Foley, Funk started laughing and jokingly suggested that they should start the match on the roof of the cell, and then Foley should be thrown off. It was meant as dark humor. But Foley stopped laughing, looked at Funk, and said he thought he could actually do it. The seed was planted. Foley pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. The Undertaker was initially highly reluctant to throw a man off a steel roof. But Foley was completely dead set on the idea. Foley viewed this stunt not as a way to launch a second act of his career, but as a desperate measure to keep his head above water before walking away from the business. He convinced them. The Undertaker trusted Foley's judgment. If Foley said he could survive it, The Undertaker would execute it. The first fall, defying gravity. On the night of June 28th, the atmosphere inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena was thick with tension. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, sat at the monitor station, the absolute best seat in the house, watching history unfold. When Foley's music hit, he did not walk into the cage. To the absolute shock of the commentators, the fans, and the executives backstage, he began to climb the outer mesh. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were completely in the dark, reacting with genuine confusion and concern. Foley had assured management he had been on top of the cell during rehearsals. That was a lie. When he reached the summit, he realized he was terrified of heights. As The Undertaker made his ominous entrance and began his own climb, Foley desperately wondered how he could gracefully climb back down without ruining his career. But there was no turning back. The match officially began almost 20 feet in the air. The roof of the cell was secured with heavy-duty zip ties, but it was not designed to support 600 pounds of moving, brawling humanity. With every step, the mesh sank by a foot. The terrifying sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena like gunshot cracks. As they brawled toward the edge of the structure, those watching backstage assumed it was a standard tease. No one truly believed a man would take a tumble from that altitude. The margin for error was non-existent. Below them, the announcer's table looked like a tiny piece of dollhouse furniture. Then it happened. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and flung him from the roof. A 300-pound man plummeted through the air in a terrifying freefall. Observers recall the moment happening simultaneously in a blink of an eye and in agonizing slow motion. Foley crashed violently through the Spanish announcer's desk. The sound of the impact was sickening. The reaction from the locker room was pure, unadulterated horror. Jim Cornette likened it to witnessing a fatal car accident. Jim Ross screamed into his microphone, asking if they had just witnessed what they thought they saw, convinced the man was dead. It is crucial to note, according to wrestling historians and medical experts, you cannot fake gravity. The impact was entirely real. Foley survived only because he possessed the spatial awareness to turn his body mid-air, landing flat to distribute the catastrophic force across the table rather than crashing head-first onto the concrete. Absolute chaos ensued. Spanish commentator Hugo Savinovic had to dive out of his chair to avoid being crushed. Terry Funk and World Wrestling Federation physician Dr. Francois Petit rushed to the wreckage. Dr. Petit, a martial artist and chiropractor known for his unorthodox but effective methods, immediately recognized that Foley had landed disastrously, dislocating his shoulder upon impact. Emergency medical personnel maneuvered a gurney to ringside. The cell itself had to be mechanically raised to allow the stretcher through. The arena fell into a stunned silence. Everyone, from the fans in the stands to Vince McMahon backstage, believed the match was over. The destruction of Mick Foley was complete. The second fall, 42 seconds of darkness. But Mick Foley is a man driven by an incomprehensible internal compass. As he lay on the stretcher, rolling up the aisle, a realization washed over him. The longer he stayed on the television screen, the more engaged the audience became. He pushed himself off the gurney, ignoring the pleas of officials, doctors, and his peers screaming at him to stay down. Foley began to march back toward the ring. He grabbed the steel mesh and started climbing again. Backstage, the awe turned into anger. Colleagues thought he was out of his mind. Yet, in that specific moment, as he dragged his battered body up the steel, Mick Foley transitioned from a strange character into an immortal wrestling legend. The Undertaker met him on the roof once more. The planned narrative was for a choke slam that would cause the cage mesh to gradually give way, allowing Foley to be safely dangled and stuffed through the hole. That is not what happened. The Undertaker gripped Foley by the throat and slammed him down. The battered zip ties failed instantly. The entire ceiling panel gave way. Foley plummeted completely unchecked, dropping like a stone directly into the center of the ring. This was the bullet they did not see coming. When Foley was thrown off the outside of the cage, he had braced for the table. Here, he had zero preparation. He crashed against the ring mat, which is essentially tightly pulled canvas over wooden boards and steel beams, offering no more forgiveness than solid cement. Worse still, as he fell, a heavy steel folding chair dropped through the hole right behind him, striking him brutally in the face upon impact. The silence this time was deafening. The Undertaker looked down through the broken roof, legitimately fearing he had just killed his opponent. Backstage, panic reached a fever pitch. Foley lay completely motionless. According to medical analysis of the event, this was the first time in Foley's career he had been knocked entirely unconscious. Personnel flooded the cage. Dr. Petit and Terry Funk desperately checked his vital signs. The Undertaker climbed down into the ring, his eyes pleading for an update. Funk softly reported that Foley was still breathing, but his eyes were vacant. For 42 agonizing seconds, Mick Foley's memory is entirely blank. If there was ever a match in the history of the sport that should have been instantly halted, this was it. But the protocol of the late 90s was different. Referees did not stop matches. They bought time. Terry Funk, recognizing the dire situation, began punching the Undertaker, forcing a distraction so the medical team could assess Foley. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the first thing he saw were Terry Funk's shoes. Driven by pure instinct, he forced himself to stand. The visual broadcast to the world was horrifying. Foley was a broken, bloody mess. A massive wound had been torn open beneath his lip. Ever the showman, Foley deliberately pushed his tongue through the gaping hole in his face for the camera, smiling a macabre, blood-soaked grin. Even more shocking, one of his front teeth had been violently knocked out by the steel chair. Medical personnel later deduced that the tooth had been knocked down into his throat, and as he gasped for air, he inhaled it upward until it lodged inside his nasal passage. The match, terrifyingly, continued. Foley demanded that they introduce thumbtacks into the ring. He intentionally threw his own battered body onto thousands of sharp steel tacks, ensuring they embedded deeply into his skin. His adrenaline was so high that he no longer registered pain. He had become a part of the pain. Finally, after 17 minutes of relentless, grueling horror, The Undertaker delivered a final maneuver and pinned Foley. The 16,000 fans in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena erupted. They realized they had just witnessed something dangerously real. Foley had risked his absolute well-being, and in return, the audience bestowed upon him their complete, unwavering belief. The aftermath and the ultimate warning. The physical toll was catastrophic. Foley suffered 15 stitches beneath his lip, a severely bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a severe concussion, and the loss of 2 teeth. Backstage, the atmosphere was a mix of immense relief and profound worry. Vince McMahon met Foley at the curtain. As doctors began pulling thumbtacks from Foley's flesh, McMahon looked him in the eye. He thanked Foley for everything he had done for the company, but he issued a stern, unequivocal warning. Foley was to promise that he would never do anything like that again. McMahon warned him that continuing to push the limits of physical human endurance would inevitably catch up to him. Foley understood the chief executive officer's words, but in his heart, he did not agree. At home, the nightmare was just beginning. Colette Foley had watched the broadcast in sheer terror. Foley usually called immediately after dangerous stunts, but due to his injuries, the call was delayed for hours. Colette was furious, screaming into the phone that his children legitimately thought they had watched their father die on live television. From that night onward, her trust that he would not jeopardize their family was shattered. Yet, professionally, the match sparked a career renaissance. Within 6 months, the man McMahon, once deemed unmarketable, was crowned the world champion. The roaring approval of the crowds became an intoxicating drug, pushing Foley to take even more extreme risks. The bar had been raised so high that it seemed nothing would ever be good enough again. The I Quit match, a step too far. The warnings issued in Pittsburgh were tragically ignored. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed his physical and psychological limits once again, this time against The Rock in the infamous I Quit match. This bout was heavily criticized for its excessive brutality. According to backstage accounts, Foley explicitly instructed The Rock to hit him as hard as possible with a steel chair, aiming for maximum realism. The planned sequence called for a limited number of strikes. Instead, Foley endured a sickening 11 unprotected chair shots to the skull while his hands were handcuffed behind his back. The event was broadcast while Colette and her 2 young children sat in the front row. They watched their father take relentless, unprotected blows to the head. Noelle Foley recounts that she has no singular memory of her father ever wrestling, heavily attributing this amnesia to the profound childhood trauma of witnessing this exact match. The sight of her father being beaten mercilessly made her sick to her stomach, wondering how a normal person could even survive 11 direct hits to the brain. Medical experts and wrestling historians look back at the I Quit match with deep regret. It was a scenario where a performer sustained legitimate, undeniable brain damage for the sake of a television storyline. For Foley, the reckoning was inevitable. Multiple medical professionals warned him that if he did not stop, he would end up permanently crippled. He suffered concussion upon concussion. His short-term memory began to fail him. There were terrifying instances where he would drive around his own neighborhood, completely unable to remember where his house was located. During a critical evaluation, An independent neurologist looked Foley in the eye and delivered the hardest truth of his life. The doctor told him he could shop around for a physician willing to clear him, but medically speaking, he should never step foot inside a wrestling ring again. The bill comes due. Today, the wrestling industry knows far more about the long-term effects of head trauma than it did in the late 90s. Every impact in a wrestling ring is roughly equivalent to a 25-mile-per-hour car crash. The specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy haunts a generation of performers who sacrificed their neurological health for crowd reactions. Foley is currently paying the heavy price for his fame. His family lives with the daily, gnawing fear of how his brain will function in 10 or 20 years. Yet, Foley himself refuses to be paralyzed by regret. Facing the unknown consequences of his career, he aggressively pursues mental exercises, engaging in spoken-word tours across the globe to keep his mind sharp, still craving the stimulation and connection of a live audience. For a long time, Foley harbored a deep, dark resentment toward the Hell in a Cell match. He fell into a depressive state, feeling that despite a lengthy and decorated career, he was only remembered for one single thing: being a stuntman who fell off a cage. It took a conversation with The Undertaker to change his perspective. The Undertaker bluntly told him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. It was a piece of surreal, sublime performance art, painted on a canvas of violence and sheer willpower. When Mick and his daughter Noelle recently visited the World Wrestling Entertainment archival warehouse, they unexpectedly stumbled upon the original steel cell. In a rare display of raw emotion, Foley reached out, touched the rusted metal, and began to cry. It was a profound realization of the magnitude of what he had survived, and a terrifying acknowledgement that his life could have easily ended on that concrete floor. Was it worth it? Mick Foley dressed up in wild costumes, engaging in a fantasy form of combat that left his body permanently broken, all to earn the acceptance of total strangers. He traded his physical well-being for the roar of the crowd. While he acknowledges that there is no financial or historical reward big enough to truly cover the risks he took, he accepts that his terrifying commitment was the exact reason for his massive success. As observers of this incredibly dangerous art form, we are left to marvel at the courage and cringe at the cost. Mick Foley gave his literal blood, sweat, and brain cells to the industry. He survived Hell in a Cell, leaving behind a legacy that will never be duplicated, and for the sake of every athlete who steps into the squared circle, a legacy that must never be attempted again. Step into the shadows of sports entertainment, ladies and gentlemen, where the line between scripted drama and terrifying reality is obliterated. This is not just a story about a wrestling match. This is an examination of human endurance, the desperate psychology of acceptance, and a night that forever altered the landscape of the World Wrestling Federation. On the 28th of June, 1998, the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, played host to the King of the Ring pay-per-view. Inside the Civic Arena, 16,000 fans waited in eager anticipation. They had paid for a spectacle, but what they were about to witness was a dangerously crazy masterpiece that would become one of the most infamous matches in wrestling history. The Undertaker versus Mankind. Hell in a Cell. To understand the sheer magnitude of this event, we must first analyze the psychology of the man behind the Mankind mask, Mick Foley. Everyone who steps into the squared circle is looking for something they find missing in their own lives. According to Foley himself, his childhood was defined by being teased. This created an overwhelming, almost dangerous need to be liked. He discovered early on that if he could not make people love him, perhaps he could disgust them, and in doing so, command their absolute attention. Accounts from his college years reveal the genesis of this extreme behavior. As a sophomore, Foley orchestrated a stunt where he took a swig of red food coloring and executed a leaping maneuver off a bed onto a stuffed object on a concrete floor. When he hit the ground, he spat the red concoction out. The reaction from his peers was visceral. One onlooker called it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that singular moment, Foley felt power. He realized he needed to get reactions, no matter the physical cost. This unyielding drive for crowd reaction gave birth to his early persona, Cactus Jack. He was a wild, charismatic figure whose matches were built on an intoxicating blend of psychology and brutality. He knew the fans gravitated toward characters who appeared genuinely out of control, individuals who seemed to rebel against the script itself. To truly grasp Foley's commitment to realism, one must look at his time in Japan. He and his wife Colette lived modestly, sleeping on a mattress on the floor with a black and white television and a video cassette recorder that barely functioned. On that machine, Foley would sometimes consume 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes in a single day. He was captivated by the realism and the storytelling where a competitor had to defeat not only their opponent but their unforgiving surroundings. In Japan, Foley found a mentor in the legendary Terry Funk, a master of making audiences suspend their disbelief. Together, they engaged in explosive, fiery death matches involving barbed wire and C4 explosives. Foley pushed his body through unimaginable agony, often taking falls directly onto the concrete. Realism became his most potent tool. By his own admission, he did not believe he had a good match unless he had trouble walking back to his hotel room. He did not enjoy the pain itself, but he relished his ability to absorb it and portray it in a way that captivated the audience. Despite his international reputation as a hardcore legend, the road to the World Wrestling Federation was fraught with resistance. At that time, the promotion was operating in a very family-friendly, sanitized era. Vince McMahon, the architect of the company, did not want Mick Foley. The corporate perception was that Foley was unmarketable, unattractive, and did not fit the corporate mold. It took the persistent advocacy of Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations at the time, to convince McMahon to take a chance on Foley. Ross recognized that The Undertaker, one of the biggest stars in the history of the industry, desperately needed a compelling dancing partner. McMahon had been feeding giants to The Undertaker, resulting in dull, plodding encounters. Ross argued that what The Undertaker truly needed was a lunatic. Reluctantly, McMahon agreed to bring Foley in, but with a strict caveat: they would cover his face. McMahon wanted to erase Foley's past identity entirely, essentially building a character out of nothing. Thus, Mankind was born. According to Gerald Briscoe, a Hall of Famer and key backstage producer, this bizarre concept would have failed miserably with anyone else. But Foley possessed a unique ability to forge a profound connection with the audience. Without that connection, any character is meaningless. The fans could sense his unwavering commitment. Leading up to the King of the Ring in 1998, Foley and The Undertaker had built a solid foundation, clashing in 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches around the globe. However, Foley felt his character had plateaued. He knew he had to do something drastic, something that would cement their legacy rather than detract from it. The stage was set with the Hell in a Cell concept. The first iteration of this match, featuring Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, had been a monumental success, a true mile marker for the industry. Foley looked at that previous match with open-jawed awe, fully aware that he lacked the athletic nimbleness of Shawn Michaels. He needed a different approach to outdo the past. The inception of the night's most terrifying moment began as a joke. Foley consulted Terry Funk about how to elevate the match. Funk laughingly suggested that it would be funny if Foley started the match on the roof of the cage, and was subsequently thrown off. While Funk meant it in jest, the idea took root in Foley's mind. He looked at Funk and stated that he could actually do it. Foley pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. According to backstage sources, The Undertaker was extremely hesitant about throwing his opponent off a massive steel structure. Foley, however, was resolute. He was not looking at this match as the beginning of a second act in his career. He viewed it as a desperate measure to keep his head above water. fully believing that when this run ended, his career would likely end with it. He sold the idea so effectively that eventually all parties agreed to the high spots. As the match approached, the tension in the locker room was palpable. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, recalled sitting at the production monitors alongside Gerald Briscoe, watching the events unfold with a sense of impending dread. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, seated at the broadcast desk, were completely in the dark about the planned stunts. When Mankind's music hit, the 16,000 fans in attendance expected him to enter the cage. Instead, he began to climb. The sight of a 300-pound man ascending the towering structure immediately created a psychological fear among the audience and the commentators. Even Foley himself later admitted that, despite assuring management he was comfortable with heights, he was terrified once he reached the top. The match officially began on the roof. Almost immediately, disaster loomed. The top section of the cage was secured only with zip ties. With 600 pounds of human weight shifting across the mesh, the structure began to give way. The zip ties snapped audibly, and the fencing sank significantly under their feet. The Undertaker and Foley moved toward the edge of the cell, directly above the announcer tables. Backstage, personnel watched the monitors in disbelief. Producers doubted Foley would actually take the fall, considering the incredibly small margin for error. The announce table below looked like miniature dollhouse furniture from 20 feet in the air. If the Undertaker threw him slightly too far or too short, Foley would plummet onto solid concrete or potentially into the crowd. Then it happened. Foley was launched off the edge of the cell. Time seemed to slow down, yet the descent was over in the blink of an eye. The sound of Foley crashing through the Spanish announce table was sickening. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, narrowly escaped being crushed by diving out of his chair at the last possible second. Backstage, the locker room erupted in genuine concern. To the professionals watching, it resembled a fatal automobile accident. Many believed they had just witnessed a man lose his life. The chaos that ensued was real. This was no longer a scripted athletic exhibition. It was a medical emergency. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley's shattered body. Dr. Francois Petit, the company physician, rushed from the medical room to the ringside area. Foley had landed terribly on his back, aggravating a dislocated shoulder. Emergency medical technicians arrived with a gurney, but the sheer logistical nightmare of the cell meant the structure had to be raised to extract the injured performer. Foley was strapped to the stretcher. The crowd, the commentators, and the locker room all believed the match was definitively over. As Foley was wheeled toward the entrance, the reality of his condition began to set in. Yet the longer he lay there, the more he realized the audience was entirely captivated. In a moment that defies logic and medical advice, Foley rolled off the gurney. The crowd erupted into a state of absolute frenzy as he began to climb the cell once again. Backstage personnel screamed at the monitors, pleading for him to stop. Jim Ross famously questioned how Foley could even stand, let alone climb. It was a display of incomprehensible endurance that forever cemented his status as a star. But it also set the stage for a second, far more catastrophic event. The next sequence was supposed to be controlled. The plan dictated that The Undertaker would execute a chokeslam, causing the cage mesh to gradually give way, suspending Foley in a dramatic visual. But reality is unforgiving. When The Undertaker delivered the maneuver, the mesh completely failed. The panels broke open, and Foley plummeted straight down, crashing violently onto the ring mat. The ring mat is not a soft cushion. It is built over a foundation of solid wood and steel. The impact was comparable to falling directly onto cement. To compound the horror, a heavy steel folding chair that had been on top of the cage fell through the opening, striking Foley directly in the face upon his impact with the mat. Backstage, the reaction shifted from concern to sheer terror. This was entirely unplanned. Foley lay motionless. His wife, watching from home, was furious and horrified. her children confused and traumatized by the violence they were witnessing. Dr. Petit, Terry Funk, and other officials flooded the ring. The Undertaker looked down from the broken roof, instructing Funk to check if Foley was still breathing. For 42 seconds, Mick Foley was legitimately unconscious. It was the first time in his career he had been completely knocked out. According to industry standards of the time, matches were rarely stopped. Instead, performers bought time. Terry Funk instinctively attacked The Undertaker to draw the cameras and the audience away from the medical crisis occurring on the mat. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first sight was Terry Funk's shoes. Driven by an adrenaline-fueled commitment to his craft, Foley refused to let the match end on a medical stoppage. He slowly rose to his feet. His physical state was catastrophic. He had suffered a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, and a severe concussion. A gaping wound was visible beneath his lip, and incredibly, a dislodged tooth had been forced up through his nasal passage, lodging in his nostril. Despite the profound trauma, Foley's instinct for television took over. He deliberately pushed his tongue through the wound in his lip to create a gruesome visual for the cameras, even flashing a disturbing smile. The pain was absolute, but the drama and the concern from everyone in the arena were equally real. As if the falls were not enough, Foley insisted on finishing the planned narrative. He introduced thumbtacks into the ring, purposefully throwing himself onto them to ensure the audience received the maximum spectacle. He understood that risking his own well-being forced the audience to believe in him completely. When the 17-minute match finally concluded with The Undertaker securing the victory, the atmosphere in the arena was one of sheer awe and exhaustion. The aftermath of Hell in a Cell was a sobering reality check. Behind the curtain, Foley was greeted by a frantic locker room. Vince McMahon approached him, expressing gratitude for his unprecedented sacrifice, but sternly warned him never to attempt anything like it again. Medical personnel spent agonizing minutes plucking thumbtacks from Foley's battered body. His injuries were extensive, requiring 15 stitches, the loss of 2 teeth, and weeks of recovery for his internal trauma. Yet, the match acted as a catalyst. Within 6 months, the man McMahon once deemed unmarketable was crowned the World Wrestling Federation champion. However, the psychological burden of being the hardcore legend demanded a constant escalation of violence. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed the boundaries of human endurance once again in a brutal I Quit match against The Rock. Despite warnings from colleagues, Foley insisted on absorbing unmitigated punishment. The original plan called for 5 chair shots to the head. Instead, Foley took 11 unprotected blows. The event was incredibly traumatizing for his family, particularly his young children, who were seated in the front row and could not separate the fictional narrative from their father's very real suffering. It remains one of the darkest chapters in his career, a stark reminder of the extreme costs associated with chasing the roar of the crowd. The long-term consequences of these decisions are a haunting reality of professional wrestling. Medical professionals repeatedly advised Foley to retire, warning him of the cumulative effects of repetitive concussions. Decades later, the specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, looms heavily over his legacy. The trauma his brain endured is akin to experiencing multiple 25-mile-per-hour car accidents. His family lives with the daily anxiety of what his neurological health will look like in 10 or 20 years. To combat the cognitive decline, Foley has engaged in spoken word tours, utilizing the performances as mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp while still satisfying his deep-seated need for audience connection. Looking back at the legacy of Hell in a Cell, we are forced to ask an uncomfortable question. Was it worth it? For years, Foley harbored resentment toward the match, feeling it overshadowed his entire body of work. He experienced periods of profound darkness, feeling as though he had accomplished nothing else of value. However, time and reflection brought acceptance. The Undertaker once reminded him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them. Both. During a visit to the company warehouse with his daughter Noelle, Foley unexpectedly encountered the original cell structure. The sight of the steel that nearly ended his life moved the hardcore legend to tears. It was a profound realization of his survival and the indelible mark he left on the industry. Mick Foley treated the wrestling ring as a canvas for a surreal, sublime, and dangerously violent form of performance art. He sacrificed his body and mortgaged his future health to earn the acceptance of total strangers. The King of the Ring in 1998 stands as a testament to that sacrifice. It is a legendary triumph of storytelling, an enduring cautionary tale, and a chilling reminder that in the world of professional wrestling, gravity cannot be faked, and the ultimate price is always paid by the performer.
Dưới đây là kịch bản bình luận hoàn chỉnh dựa trên dữ liệu bạn đã cung cấp, được thiết kế theo phong cách một chương trình tài liệu điều tra thể thao chuyên sâu, tuân thủ tuyệt đối mọi quy định về ngôn ngữ, chữ số và văn phong.
Ladies and gentlemen, step back in time with me to the 28th of June, 1998. We are inside the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. On this night, the World Wrestling Federation presented the King of the Ring pay-per-view event. What the 16,000 fans in attendance and the millions watching at home were about to witness was not just a wrestling match. It was a descent into absolute madness, a spectacle that would permanently alter the landscape of professional wrestling and push the boundaries of human endurance to a terrifying edge. This was The Undertaker taking on mankind in the demonic structure known as Hell in a Cell. According to the accounts of those involved, the Hell in a Cell structure hits you like a heavy mallet to the consciousness. The anticipation was palpable. The audience knew it was going to be chaotic, but no one, not the fans, not the production crew, and perhaps not even the executives in the back, knew it was going to be that extreme. On that night, you had two generational talents out there who liked to really push that proverbial envelope until it completely toppled over the edge of sanity. We often hear the criticism that professional wrestling is predetermined. But as the events of that evening proved, you absolutely cannot fake gravity. I have been frightened by a lot of things in the professional wrestling industry over my decades. Behind the microphone. Yet, nothing frightened me as much as the events that transpired in that cell. At least until the match progressed into even darker territory later on. What left the fans utterly stunned was the unrelenting, horrifying punishment that Mick Foley, the man behind the Mankind mask, willingly endured. Until you saw it with your own two eyes, you simply did not believe that a living, breathing person could physically do this to their body and live to talk about it. This match was real. The agonizing pain was real. The sheer, unadulterated drama was real. Backstage, executives and agents were cursing, screaming, and calling him a complete and utter idiot for putting his life on the line. Why, they asked, are you doing this? As one of professional wrestling's most infamous and widely discussed matches, the legacy of this Hell in a Cell encounter persists today as both an epic, undeniable success and a grim cautionary tale. According to the sources mentioned, the company dodged several bullets that day. It is truly astonishing to think that the officials would allow someone to go completely unconscious in the middle of a ring and then just simply allow the match to continue. The collateral damage that ensued from that decision is an entirely different story. It begs the eternal questions of this industry. When does it stop? When is it finally enough? You pay all day long for the desperate decisions you make during your 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece, a twisted Mona Lisa painted in blood and broken bones. But all of us, from the fans to the promoters, need to ask ourselves a very difficult question. Was it truly worth it? To understand the madness of that night, we must first deeply analyze the psychology of the man who created it. Everyone who gets into the professional wrestling business is looking for something that they find missing in their own personal lives. For Mick Foley, The answer was rooted in his childhood. According to his own reflections, he was teased mercilessly during his youth. This constant ridicule created an overwhelming, almost insatiable need to be liked by others. It birthed a burning desire to capture that World Wrestling Federation Championship belt. The document suggests that his desperate need for a reaction manifested early. For example, during his sophomore year in college, Foley took a massive swig of red food coloring. He then executed a spectacular, flying leap off a dormitory bed, crashing onto a stuffed animal resting on a cold concrete floor. When his body hit the unyielding concrete, he spat that fake blood concoction out for everyone to see. Everybody in the dormitory had gathered to watch this bizarre spectacle. Foley recalled hearing one of the female students yell out that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that precise moment, Mick Foley felt a rush of absolute power. A realization dawned on him. If he could not make people love him, perhaps he could make them feel something else. Perhaps he could disgust them. He just needed to get reactions. This man, who would become globally known as the hardcore legend, survived hell in a cell because his entire life was built on surviving the impossible just to make people watch. Today, many point to that specific hell in a cell match as the perfect gateway into professional wrestling. Countless fans have stated that it was the very first match they were ever shown, and it instantly transformed them into huge, lifelong fans. But the follow-up question from veterans of the business is always the same. Did you expect all wrestling matches to be like that? Because the reality is, they are not. A standard Mick Foley match was already notoriously brutal. It usually involved blood, thumbtacks, and sometimes even fire. He was known for putting his body through unimaginable torment. He would take bumps directly on the exposed concrete. According to the documents provided, during his time in Japan, he was even subjected to explosions involving composition for plastic explosives. He was speared through flaming tables. He pushed his physical vessel through so much agony that it defies medical logic. His daughter, Noelle Foley, has noted that her father simply loved getting a shocked reaction from the crowd. He thrived on the gasps, the horrified screams, and the sheer disbelief of the audience. Realism was his primary tool of the trade. Foley genuinely believed that he was not having a good performance unless he physically struggled to walk back to his hotel room at the end of the night. He did not necessarily enjoy the physical pain itself, but he deeply enjoyed the fact that he possessed the unique resilience to take that punishment and sell it to the audience in a way that was highly entertaining. But who is the man beneath the scars? Colette Foley, who has known Mick for over 35 years, provides a stark contrast to the brutal image we see on our television screens. When she first met Mick, she noticed his eyes. She saw a gentle, incredibly nice human being. It was his corny jokes and terrible sense of humor that truly made her fall in love with him. In a detail that beautifully humanizes the hardcore legend, their wedding song was actually the theme from Beauty and the Beast. They were a solid team. Colette understood his unyielding commitment to his craft. She understood that when the adrenaline began pumping through his veins, his only desire was for the audience to leave the arena talking about how great the show was, even if it came at his own grave personal risk. That burning drive to entertain pushed him to get more and more reckless along the way. Before the World Wrestling Federation, Foley developed a wildly popular, chaotic persona known as Cactus Jack. He was a wild, unpredictable figure. Watching him, you genuinely thought he might be clinically insane. He possessed an undeniable charisma. You simply could not take your eyes off this man. He was entirely different from the polished athletes of the era. Jim Cornette, who was working as a producer and agent for the World Wrestling Federation at the time of the Hell in a Cell event, noted that Mick was absolutely excellent with the psychological aspect of his matches. He understood that the fans gravitated toward performers who appeared completely out of control, individuals who seemed to be fiercely rebelling against the established script. Foley had a unique gift. He could take the audience on a terrifying emotional ride and elicit the exact, visceral response he desired. Through this unparalleled dedication, all the attention would focus squarely on him, and his legendary reputation began to grow. The document suggests that Foley's dedication to his craft bordered on an obsession. Early in his marriage, his bedroom furniture consisted of a simple mattress laid bare on the floor, accompanied by a small black and white television set and a videocassette recorder that barely functioned. Inside that videocassette recorder were tapes of brutal Japanese wrestling matches. Foley would sometimes sit and study these violent Japanese wrestling tapes for up to 12 hours a single day. He was deeply drawn to the realism and the intricate storytelling. In his mind, it was not merely about man fighting against man. It was about a man battling and defeating his dangerous surroundings. For a long time, Foley believed that the Japanese wrestling circuit was where he would spend the entirety of his career making a living. The promoters over in Japan were actively searching for a foreign talent who could enter into a bitter rivalry with the legendary Terry Funk. Terry Funk was widely considered one of the greatest performers of all time, specifically for his uncanny ability to make an audience suspend their disbelief in a matter of seconds. Funk eventually became a beloved mentor to Foley. Together, they began working in these highly explosive, incredibly bloody, violent, and fiery death matches across Japan. Foley was always naturally drawn to the wildest, most dangerous aspects of the business. He would literally leave the ring on his hands and knees, covered in his own blood, and he viewed that suffering as absolute proof that he had achieved something truly special. He viewed this extreme violence as the only way to make himself stand out in a crowded industry. Because of this extreme, violent style, Foley never truly saw himself fitting into the corporate mold of the World Wrestling Federation. At that specific time, the World Wrestling Federation was operating under a strict general audience rating. The programming was very sanitized and bland. For a gritty, brutal performer like Mick Foley, his rugged style simply did not mesh with the family-friendly product the company was selling. Al Snow, a former superstar and Foley's travel partner, noted that the chairman of the company, Vince McMahon, originally had absolutely no desire to hire Mick Foley. McMahon did not believe Foley was marketable. He did not think Foley was physically attractive enough for television. It took the persistence of Jim Ross, who was serving as the vice president of talent relations at the time, to convince McMahon to take a chance. Ross pleaded with McMahon to trust his expert eye for talent because he saw something incredibly special in Foley. The company desperately needed compelling opponents for their top-tier stars. The Undertaker was already established as one of the biggest, most formidable stars in the history of the wrestling business. According to Jim Ross, McMahon kept trying to pair The Undertaker with giant, lumbering opponents, a formula that was quickly becoming boring and remarkably dull to the audience. What The Undertaker truly needed was a lunatic, someone who would show absolutely no fear. The stories claim that McMahon finally slammed his hand down on a desk and agreed to bring Foley in. But under one strict, non-negotiable condition, they had to completely cover up his face. McMahon demanded that the audience not know who he was or anything about his past. In McMahon's initial perception, Foley was a nobody. Jerry Briscoe, a legendary Hall of Fame producer, recalled that the creative team was suddenly tasked with building a compelling television character out of absolutely nothing. And from that corporate mandate, the character of Mankind was born. He was a deranged, tortured soul who dwelled in boiler rooms and wore a horrifying leather mask. As Briscoe correctly pointed out, this bizarre, seemingly impossible gimmick would not have worked with any other human being on the planet except Mick Foley. Without a genuine, emotional connection to the audience, and without a deep commitment to the character, all the theatrical elements are entirely meaningless. But the fans possess a sixth sense. They can always sense true commitment. Jim Ross's ultimate goal was to ensure that Foley became a legendary opponent for The Undertaker. Foley was willing to try absolutely anything to make the rivalry succeed. As Ross affectionately noted, referencing an old phrase, Foley did not turn anything down but his bed covers. But this immense dedication created a massive challenge for the company's management. They had to figure out how to stop this man from literally killing himself on live television. The Undertaker and Mankind laid an incredible foundation for their rivalry. They battled through 7 high-profile pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches, traveling all around the globe together. However, as time passed, Foley felt that his Mankind character had somewhat plateaued. He knew he needed to do something drastic, something monumental that would add to their shared legacy rather than detract from it. This brings us to the summer of 1998. For the King of the Ring event, the producers planned to reignite this iconic feud by utilizing a recently developed, highly dangerous match concept, Hell in a Cell. Traditionally, the way the company handled steel cage matches was that a competitor had to escape by either climbing over the top of the chain-link fencing or by walking out through the cage door. Foley had actually approached Vince McMahon previously, asking how they could make a cage match feel different. Foley pitched the idea of putting a solid roof on the cage, creating an environment where 2 men go inside, but only one walks out. Thus, the concept of Hell in a Cell was born. The very first Hell in a Cell match had taken place months prior, featuring The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. It was considered an absolute masterpiece, a historical mile marker for the industry. Foley himself looked at that first match with his jaw wide open in awe, knowing he could not replicate the incredible athletic feats performed by Michaels and The Undertaker. Roughly 9 months after that inaugural match, Foley found himself scheduled to step into that same demonic structure with The Undertaker. Looking for inspiration, Foley asked his mentor, Terry Funk, what they should do to make their match memorable. According to the accounts of those involved, Funk began to laugh and jokingly suggested that they should start the match on the very top of the cell roof, and that Foley should allow himself to be thrown off. Funk meant it as a dark, humorous joke. But when Funk stopped laughing, Foley looked him dead in the eye and stated that he believed he could actually survive a fall like that. From that moment on, Foley could not get the terrifying idea out of his head. He strategically pitched the idea of being thrown off the massive structure to both The Undertaker and Vince McMahon during a casual conversation. It was a masterful act of persuasion. The Undertaker was extremely hesitant and was not initially on board with throwing his opponent off a structure of that immense height. Foley, however, remained dead set on the idea. Eventually, he managed to convince the decision-makers to allow it. Foley was not viewing this match as the grand second act of his wrestling career. He was merely viewing it as a desperate way to keep his head above water in a highly competitive industry. He genuinely believed that after this specific run of matches was over, his career would be finished. Did The Undertaker know exactly what Foley had planned going into this event? Yes. Foley had detailed the major high-risk maneuvers to him, assuring everyone that he would be perfectly fine. The Undertaker trusted Foley's judgment. If Foley could visualize it in his mind, he believed he could safely execute it. As the fateful night in Pittsburgh arrived, the commentators set the stage, reminding the audience that they had only ever witnessed one Hell in a Cell matchup in history. The pressure resting on Foley's shoulders as he walked down the aisle must have been astronomically heavy. He knew the audience was comparing him to Shawn Michaels. He knew he had to somehow outdo a masterpiece, and he knew he was not exactly the most nimble, athletic competitor in the locker room. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and member of the ring crew at the time, was stationed backstage watching the monitors alongside producer Gerald Briscoe. They had the best seat in the entire building, sitting right in front of a bank of monitors, ready to witness history. As the match was about to begin, absolutely no one in the arena knew what to anticipate. No one could have ever imagined the sheer horror they were about to witness. Jim Ross, calling the action at ringside alongside Jerry Lawler, was just as much in the dark as any fan sitting on their couch at home, Foley wanted to start the match in a way that nobody had ever attempted before. As the ominous music played, mankind began to scale the outside of the gigantic steel structure. You could see the sheer shock radiating across the faces of the fans. Why is he going up? The match is supposed to happen inside the cage. What kind of completely illogical, unstable psychology is this? As the commentators noted, the man seemed to be in desperate need of intense psychological therapy. Here is the most terrifying detail. Despite assuring Vince McMahon and The Undertaker that he was comfortable with the stunt, Foley had never actually been on top of the cell structure before that moment. When he finally reached the roof, he was absolutely terrified. He admitted later that he is not actually good with heights. The entire time The Undertaker was making his slow, dramatic entrance, Foley was standing on that precarious roof, desperately trying to figure out how he could gracefully climb back down without ruining his professional reputation. But there was no turning back. The match officially commenced on the roof. The very environment created a deep, paralyzing fear in the minds of the viewers. The production crew had attached the top chain link sections of the cage using simple plastic zip. Yes. Suddenly, there was over 600 pounds of human mass walking across that fragile mesh. Every single time The Undertaker or Foley took a heavy step, the metal mesh would sag dramatically by about a full foot. You could audibly hear the plastic zip ties snapping and springing off the metal frame under the intense pressure. The structural integrity of the cell was failing in real time. When those plastic zip ties started aggressively popping off, everyone watching realized a catastrophic accident was highly probable. Foley attempted to execute a suplex maneuver on the roof, but The Undertaker wisely cut the move off, recognizing the severe danger that they could both inadvertently crash straight through the failing mesh and fall to the ring below. The two giants traded heavy punches, slowly inching closer and closer toward the edge of the cage structure, directly above the ringside announcer tables. Even veteran observers believed there was simply no way Foley would take a tumble off a cage that high. The margin for error was terrifyingly small. Looking down from that altitude, the ringside announcer table looked as small as a child's dollhouse piece. It seemed physically impossible to hit that target safely. But as they moved dangerously close to the precipice, the dreadful realization washed over the arena. And then the unthinkable happened. From nearly 20 feet in the air, a 300-pound human being was violently flung toward the Spanish announcer desk. According to Foley, the terrifying descent felt as though it was happening in slow motion. Yet it simultaneously passed in the blink of an eye. The impact was catastrophic. A sickening crash echoed throughout the arena. The commentators and the fans were left in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. Did we just witness a man die on live television? The horrific sound of Foley's body destroying that wooden table was chilling. Backstage, the locker room erupted in sheer panic and deep concern. Witnessing that fall was akin to watching a horrific, high-speed automobile accident. Many honestly thought Foley was dead on impact. A man's life seemed to just stop dead in its tracks. In an industry built on wild, chaotic stunts, absolutely nobody had ever attempted something this reckless. It blew the collective minds of the wrestling world. Everyone assumed the match was immediately over. There was no conceivable way a human body could absorb that impact and get back to its feet. An audible, collective gasp of pure horror swept through the arena. Colette Foley was watching from home with their two young children. They were entirely confused and terrified by what they were seeing. Colette frantically tried to soothe them, repeatedly telling them that the violence was fake, all while her own mind was screaming in sheer panic. It is incredibly difficult for a family to know when the violence on screen has crossed the line into grim reality, but it was painfully obvious that this stunt had severely injured him. The danger was absolute. If The Undertaker had thrown Foley just a few inches too far, or a few inches too short, Foley would have plummeted directly onto the unyielding concrete floor. Or worse, directly into the crowd of unsuspecting fans. Miraculously, Foley had visualized the terrifying fall in his head beforehand. In midair, he managed to twist his large frame in such a specific way that he landed perfectly flat on the announcer desk, utilizing the collapsing structure to somewhat cushion the devastating fall and prevent a fatal injury. Down at ringside, chaos reigned. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, had to physically dive out of his chair to avoid being crushed by the falling superstar. Savinovic later admitted the moment was deeply traumatic. He was torn between basic human compassion for a suffering friend and the strict, unwritten rule of the wrestling business: you never interfere with a performer's match. The fans were standing in stunned silence, looking at the broken body of a man laying at their feet. Referees and medical attendants immediately rushed the area. The legendary Terry Funk was the very first person to reach Foley, frantically checking to see if his friend was even conscious. Backstage, Dr. François Petit, the company's brilliant and somewhat eccentric medical professional, heard the frantic calls over the radio. Petit was a fascinating character, a martial arts expert and a highly skilled medical practitioner who confidently believed he could fix any physical malady. The medical team rushed to ringside, completely unsure of how to navigate a gurney through the wreckage. They actually had to temporarily raise the massive steel cell, with the Undertaker still standing ominously on the roof just to fit the medical equipment through. Foley was strapped to a gurney. It was not a scripted medical angle. This was a highly legitimate medical emergency. They were preparing to rush him to the nearest trauma center. The commentators, the fans, and the officials all believed the match was definitively over. What else could possibly be done? But as the medical personnel began rolling the gurney up the aisle, a terrifying thought crossed Foley's concussed mind. He realized that the longer he stayed on that stretcher, the more deeply the audience became emotionally engaged. Against all medical advice and basic human instinct, Foley realized he was going to continue. He slowly rolled off the gurney. Officials and friends surrounded him, frantically begging him to stop. They screamed at him to stay down, asking him where he was going and why he was doing this. But Foley, bleeding and battered, began a slow, agonizing march back toward the demonic structure. The crowd realized what was happening and erupted into a frenzy. How could he possibly climb the cage again? His body was shattered, yet fueled by an inexplicable, deeply concerning adrenaline rush. Foley began to pull himself up the side of the steel mesh once more. Reflecting on this moment, it is clear that while observers thought he was a completely insane idiot, this specific, defiant act of getting off the gurney is what permanently cemented his legacy as a massive star. The backstage area was packed with anxious wrestlers and officials. They knew the situation had spiraled wildly out of control. Jimmy Corderas, watching the monitors, sensed deeply that the carnage was far from over. From a storytelling perspective, Foley's return added an unforgettable, legendary chapter to the match. But as veterans know, sometimes performers can storyline themselves right into a hospital bed. The next sequence in Foley's script was designed to be far less concerning than the initial fall off. The roof. The two men had previously agreed on executing one chokeslam maneuver on top of the cage. The original plan was for the mesh to gradually give way, creating a powerful visual of The Undertaker violently stuffing Foley down through the roof. But according to the sources mentioned, that is not what happened. And suddenly, they had a massive life-threatening problem on their hands. The chokeslam was delivered, but instead of the mesh sagging, the metal panel completely gave way in an instant. It was a completely different, entirely uncontrolled situation compared to the first fall. Foley plummeted straight down through the roof, free falling toward the center of the ring. Watching from the production area, officials knew instantly that this was a catastrophic error. Jim Cornette screamed at the television monitors, violently cursing. He desperately tried to get the production truck or Vince McMahon on the telephone to stop the horror, but he could not get through to anybody. Back home, Colette Foley watched her husband laying motionless and completely lifeless in the center of the ring. How does a mother explain to her children that their father is simply acting when the danger is this? Horrifyingly real? The fall through the roof was entirely unexpected. Many in the back thought that was truly the end of his life. When Foley's body hit the ring, he did not hit a soft cushion. A wrestling ring is constructed of tight canvas over wooden boards and solid steel beams. Hitting it from that immense height is akin to hitting solid cement. But the fall itself was not the most dangerous part. As Foley was plummeting through the air, a heavy, solid steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell directly behind him. When Foley violently crashed into the ring mat, that massive steel chair landed directly onto his unprotected face. It was a sickening, brutal impact. He could have very easily died in that exact moment. Colette Foley thought she had just watched her husband pass away. She was furious, believing her husband had betrayed her trust by secretly planning a second, even more dangerous stunt. The brutal reality was that for the very first time in his long, violent career, Mick Foley had been legitimately knocked out completely cold. Medical personnel and officials flooded into the locked cage. Dr. Petit and Terry Funk rushed into the ring, genuinely fearing they were witnessing the end of Foley's life. He was entirely unresponsive. According to the accounts of those involved, Funk looked up at The Undertaker, who was staring down through the broken roof, and firmly stated that the match was over. Funk could look into Foley's lifeless eyes and see that nobody was home. The Undertaker, trapped on the roof, asked Funk to check if Foley was even still breathing. Funk checked his pulse and reported back that he was barely still clinging to consciousness. Foley later recalled that while he had seen stars many times in his rough career, he had never been unconscious for more than a few seconds. This time, there is a terrifying gap of 42 seconds in his memory that he can never recover. In a brilliant, desperate act of improvisation, Terry Funk took matters into his own hands to buy the medical team precious time. Funk walked up to The Undertaker and demanded to be hit. The Undertaker obliged, choke-slamming Funk out of his shoes. This violent distraction drew the television cameras and the audience's attention away from the medical emergency happening on the mat, allowing the doctors to frantically tend to Foley. If there was ever a match in the history of the sport that should have been immediately halted, it was this one. But in that specific era of the industry, matches were rarely stopped for injuries. They simply bought time, and Foley needed every single second he could get. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the very first thing he saw was Terry Funk's wrestling shoes laying on the canvas. Slowly, the foggy realization dawned on him. He was still in the middle of a massive pay-per-view match. Relying on pure, unadulterated instinct, Foley somehow managed to drag his shattered body back to a standing position. Backstage observers had absolutely no clue how a human being could still be standing. He was an absolute, horrifying physical mess. It remains a dark stain on the industry's history that officials allowed a man to be knocked unconscious, sustain massive head trauma, and then simply continue a grueling athletic contest. As the deep fog began to clear from Foley's traumatized brain, his singular focus returned to entertaining the audience. He realized he had a massive, gaping wound completely piercing the skin beneath his lower lip. In a grotesque display of showmanship, Foley realized that if he forced his tongue through that bloody hole, it would create an unforgettable, gruesome image for the television cameras. And through the blood and the pain, he smiled. It was in that horrifying moment that the cameras captured something truly bizarre. One of Foley's front teeth was firmly lodged inside his nasal cavity. How does a man get hit in the face with a steel chair so hard that his tooth is knocked out and ends up in his nose? According to the medical staff, the immense force of the chair shot knocked the tooth down his throat. However, because Foley was gasping and breathing so heavily in panic, he forcefully inhaled the tooth back up through his respiratory system, lodging it into his nasal passage. The expressions of absolute horror on the faces of the officials, the fans, and The Undertaker were entirely genuine. They were looking into the eyes of a man who was running purely on dangerous adrenaline. And yet, Foley was not finished. He turned to the referee and demanded they move to the next planned sequence, the thumbtacks. This match marked the very first appearance of thumbtacks in a World Wrestling Federation ring. Foley felt an intense personal responsibility to introduce this ultra-violent element to the audience. In the final, agonizing moments of the match, Foley was forcefully slammed onto thousands of sharp metal thumbtacks. He purposely rolled his battered body around on the mat to ensure the tacks deeply pierced his skin, maximizing the gruesome visual effect. When adrenaline completely takes over a performer's body, they do not realize the pain anymore. They become a part of the pain. They push their limits so far they lose touch with physical reality. Foley was determined to see his brutal masterpiece through to the bitter end, come hell or high water. Finally, after 17 excruciating minutes of unbridled torture, the match concluded with The Undertaker defeating Mankind. The 16,000 fans inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena had witnessed a spectacle unlike anything in the history of the sport. The medical team rushed the stretcher back to ringside, firmly believing it was absolutely necessary this time. But incredibly, Foley waved them off. He refused the stretcher. The crowd erupted into an absolute frenzy of respect and awe. The injuries were as real as a heart attack, and the audience could feel that visceral reality. That unbelievable display of toughness firmly placed the fans in the corner of a man who simply could not be destroyed. Foley fundamentally understood a core truth of professional wrestling. An audience invests their time, their hard-earned money, and their emotional effort into believing in the performers. By risking his own personal well-being, Foley allowed the fans to deeply, thoroughly believe in his character and the violent experience he provided. As the broadcast faded to black, a collective sigh of relief washed over the wrestling world. Thank God it was finally over. But the haunting question lingered. Why take so many incredibly dangerous chances? What was the ultimate purpose of this self-destruction? For Colette Foley, the nightmare was just beginning. Foley had a strict personal rule. He would always call his wife immediately after a match to check in and let her know he was physically okay. But on the night of the most dangerous match of his entire career, the one night she desperately needed that reassuring phone call, the phone remained completely silent. She waited in agonizing silence for hours. Her deep worry quickly morphed into fierce anger. When Foley finally called her several hours later, she screamed at him through the receiver, telling him that his own children believed he had died on television. Prior to Hell in a Cell, Colette trusted that her husband would never do anything to truly jeopardize their family's future. After that night, his health became a massive, constant source of anxiety. When Foley finally stumbled back through the curtain into the backstage area, the entire locker room rushed forward to check on him. Vince McMahon, the man who originally did not even want to hire Foley, was one of the very first people to greet him. McMahon looked at the bleeding, battered superstar and thanked him deeply for everything he had done for the company. But McMahon immediately followed that gratitude with a stern directive. He made Foley promise that he would never, ever do anything like that again. The physical toll was staggering. Foley was so severely concussed that as he walked backstage, while the medical staff was literally using tweezers to pull hundreds of metal thumbtacks out of his flesh, he turned to The Undertaker and genuinely asked if they had remembered to do the thumbtack spot. His short-term memory was completely obliterated. Friends and colleagues were deeply shaken. Jim Ross recalled that his only thought was whether Foley was truly going to be okay. Foley himself did not fully anticipate the severe consequences of his actions. That night in the hotel room, he was in such tremendous pain that someone had to physically help him undress and climb into bed. The official medical report was a nightmare: 15 stitches below his lower lip, multiple lost teeth, a dislocated jaw, a severely dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney that bothered him for 6 weeks, and a massive, traumatic concussion. Yet, despite the catastrophic injuries. That singular match completely changed the way the world viewed Mick Foley. It sparked an incredible career renaissance. Just 6 months after McMahon initially wanted nothing to do with him, Foley captured the World Wrestling Federation Championship. But success in the wrestling business is an incredibly dangerous drug. The deafening reaction of the crowd, the immense pop, the rush of adrenaline. It fueled a dangerous cycle. The more Foley achieved, the more reckless risks he felt compelled to take, which deeply terrified his wife. The bar for violence had been set impossibly high by the Hell in a Cell match, and Foley constantly felt immense pressure to live up to his moniker as the hardcore legend. The executives and friends who cared about him issued stern warnings. They told him clearly that if he continued to push the extreme limits of physical human endurance, his violent style would eventually catch up with him and destroy his body. Foley understood their concern, but he stubbornly refused to agree with them. He felt a deep, unwavering obligation to his opponents and to the paying audience to constantly deliver something they had never witnessed before. Just 7 short months after the horrors of Hell in a Cell, Foley once again completely disregarded his physical limits. This time, the setting was the infamous I Quit match against the incredibly popular superstar, The Rock. The match was designed to be extraordinarily brutal from the opening bell, but things quickly spiraled out of control. Foley, always wanting to push the boundaries, had explicitly told The Rock to hit him as hard as he could with a steel chair. The Rock proceeded to handcuff Foley's hands tightly behind his back, rendering him completely defenseless. The original script called for Foley to take 5 unprotected chair shots to the head. 5 shots is already an incredibly dangerous, medically unadvisable number. But in the intense heat of the moment, Foley ended up taking a staggering 11 unprotected, sickeningly violent chair shots directly to his skull. The footage of this match is deeply disturbing to watch. Foley, hands bound, stumbling blindly around the ring, absorbing blow after blow from a heavy steel weapon. His wife and children were present in the arena. His young children were not old enough to differentiate between the scripted entertainment of professional wrestling and the grim reality of their father being brutally beaten. The terrifying truth of that night is that while the storyline was completely fictional, the severe brain damage Foley suffered was an absolute fact. He sacrificed his neurological health for a television angle. Where does the madness end? How much punishment does it take to finally put a man down? The trauma of that night left deep, permanent scars on his family. His daughter, Noelle Foley, has admitted something incredibly tragic. Despite growing up in the industry, she does not possess one single memory of her father ever wrestling. She believes her brain actively blocked out those memories because the violence was simply too traumatic for a child to process. She has spoken openly about the sickening reality of those 11 chair shots. If a normal human being were to absorb 11 direct impacts to the skull with a steel chair, they would likely die. The sheer brutality of the I Quit match is a deeply painful subject for the Foley family. Foley's relentless desire to over-deliver to the audience eventually caught up with him. He fully understood that his chosen style of performance would result in a lifetime of great physical discomfort. He later admitted that there were countless times in his career where he could have easily executed a maneuver in a much safer, less painful manner. But he consciously chose not to, simply because he believed the more painful version looked slightly better for the television cameras. Eventually, a handful of medical professionals intervened. Doctors explicitly warned him that if he did not stop wrestling immediately, he would end up permanently crippled. But did those severe medical warnings stop the hardcore legend? Of course not. Foley stubbornly believed he had one more great match left inside of him, and he actively set about trying to delay the inevitable end of his career. There were many times during the twilight of his run when Foley absolutely should not have been medically cleared to compete. He was suffering from massive cognitive issues. The documents note that he would drive his car around his own neighborhood and suddenly realize he could not remember where his own house was located. He was suffering the compounding effects of suffering concussion upon concussion upon concussion, when a WWE-affiliated neurologist refused to medically clear him to wrestle. Foley sought out an independent medical opinion, desperately hoping for a different answer. He vividly remembers the chilling words of that independent doctor. The neurologist looked him in the eye and stated that while Foley could continue searching for a doctor willing to clear him, the medical reality was that he should never, ever step foot inside a wrestling ring again. When a human being pushes their physical limits to the absolute extreme, similar to surviving a 25-mile-per-hour car crash every single night, they will inevitably pay a terrible price. Sadly, Mick Foley is paying that heavy price today. During the peak of his career, the medical community and the wrestling industry simply did not fully understand the devastating long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries. Today, Foley lives with immense physical pain and the terrifying shadow of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This disease is a direct result of repetitive concussions and severe brain trauma. His daughter Noelle worries every single day about what her father's cognitive health will look like 10 or 20 years down the road. Foley himself is deeply aware of the terrifying reality he faces. He has admitted that he does not see a clear way out of the neurological damage he has inflicted upon himself. But true to his legendary fighting spirit, he refuses to surrender. He is actively fighting the cognitive decline. He is determined to be someone who continues to keep his mind sharp as he ages. To combat the memory loss, Foley travels the country performing spoken word shows. He refers to these performances as mental gymnastics for his mind. Standing on a stage, connecting with an audience, and hearing the crowd chant his name provides the vital mental stimulation that keeps him going. He has chosen to deeply appreciate the wonderful life he has built rather than living in paralyzing fear of an unknown medical future. Mick Foley lived his ultimate dream. He achieved a level of fame and respect that few in the history of the business will ever touch. He is widely recognized as a multiple-time world champion and a generous philanthropist who has donated immense time and energy to various charities. But despite all of his diverse accomplishments, the single event that defines his entire legacy is Hell in a Cell. For many years, Foley actually harbored a deep, dark resentment toward that specific match. He fell into a dark place psychologically because he felt that despite a long, incredibly diverse career, he was only remembered for being thrown off a cage. On one hand, he knew he had achieved massive success. On the other hand, he felt as though his actual wrestling skills were completely overshadowed by one crazy stunt. The turning point in his perspective came during a quiet conversation with The Undertaker. They were reminiscing about their careers, and The Undertaker looked at Foley and told him a profound truth. What they accomplished together on that night in Pittsburgh will outlive them both. That conversation was a major step for Foley in finally embracing the monumental legacy of the match. He realized that creating immortal moments that leave the audience in absolute awe is exactly why he entered the professional wrestling business in the first place. Very few performers in the history of the world possess the unique ability to genuinely put an audience in a state of pure awe. Mick Foley is one of those rare individuals. Years later, Foley and his daughter Noelle were walking through a massive WWE warehouse facility. Unexpectedly, they stumbled upon the original Hell in a Cell structure. Foley was completely unprepared for the flood of intense emotions. As he reached out and touched the cold, rusty steel mesh, the hardcore legend, a man who had endured fire, barbed wire, and thumbtacks without shedding a tear, began to openly cry. Noelle had never seen her father cry before that moment. For a piece of steel to elicit such a powerful emotional reaction, she realized just how monumental, life-changing, and utterly terrifying that night truly was. Looking back at the carnage, Foley acknowledges how incredibly lucky he is to simply be alive. He firmly states that there is absolutely no financial reward big enough to justify taking a risk of That magnitude. While he acknowledges that the medical knowledge regarding head injuries was severely lacking during his era, he cannot say with absolute certainty that he would have altered his violent path, even if he had known the catastrophic risks. Mick Foley viewed the violent canvas of professional wrestling as an opportunity to create surreal, sublime performance art. There were countless broken bones, concussions, and terrifying bumps along the road, but he ultimately views it as a truly magical way to make a living. Because on those special nights, when the crowd roared and the adrenaline flowed, being Mankind, being Cactus Jack, being Mick Foley was one of the most powerful, undeniable feelings in the entire world. The world of professional wrestling is a theater of pain, a grand stage where athletes sacrifice their physical well-being for the roar of the crowd. But within the history of this grueling industry, there are moments that transcend the script, moments where the illusion shatters and the very real threat of tragedy takes over. I have sat ringside for decades. I have called the action for the World Wrestling Federation, World Championship Wrestling, and countless other promotions. I have seen the highest of highs and the darkest of shadows. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepares you for the sheer terror and the legendary spectacle